afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Kerstin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of OpenOcean, and we help companies to scale up in Europe. And we're here today to talk about investing in deep tech in Europe. And not only that, we're talking about deep tech made in Europe, and we have 4 great speakers with us. They're all going to be online joining us, so excuse that I'm all by myself on the stage right now, but we have 4 incredible speakers with us that are just coming up on screen in a second. And we have with us, just as an introduction, Anne-Sophie Carrese, partner at Elaia Partners. We have Emily Meads, analyst at Speedinvest. We have Sam Hields, associate at OpenOcean, and we have Kuan, CTO and co-founder at IQM. Welcome all of you, and welcome on stage. Good afternoon. I would just go around one quick introduction round so that you can, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe already, dive into, let's say, maybe your focus in deep tech. And then I will start with our further questions. Anne-Sophie, why don't you go first?
Yes, sure. Hello, everybody. So my name is Anne-Sophie. I'm an engineer by training. I started in the fighter aircrafts for defense industry. I was test engineer for Rafale aircraft. And I discovered that investing in technology startups was another way to go high and fast. And then I joined Elaia Partners. We are a deep tech investment company. We've been working in investing in tech for 20 years now. We have 600 million euro under management. And our DNA is obviously tech because we are 1/3 former entrepreneurs in tech, 1/3 former PhD in science, and 1/3 former engineer tech background. So we back tech disruptors, and we take them at the very early stage where we can grasp some low valuation. Sometimes we co-create the company with them, and we accompany them through successor rounds, years after years, and they all have global ambition until growth development and big global exit. So we've had 3 unicorns in our portfolio. We have 600 million euro under management, and our companies all go global, from laboratories to global worldwide players.
Well, thanks so much. We will talk about that in a second, especially about investing at the very early stage, at the seed stage, and about the challenges and the potential that we are still, having in Europe. I want to go next from, early stage to scaling up. So, Kuan and Tan, can you just, say a few words about your company?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Kuan Tan. Just a self-introduction first. I'm a physicist by training. I studied various aspects of quantum computing technologies for more than a decade before I moved to corporate world to work at Microsoft. And then I sort of moved to this startup world by founding a company called IQM with 3 other physicists. My role in the company is the CTO, and I oversee, of course, the R&D, engineering, and eventually productization of quantum computing technologies. So IQM now is a scale-up company after a little bit less than 3 years, with 130 people span across 3 countries in Europe. We build quantum computers based on superconducting qubits technology, and we deliver it to customers on premises. Thus far, we have closed 2 rounds of funding, namely the seed funding round and the Series A, and we have a couple of successful sales cases also. So, of course, like quantum computers, the aim is like one day we can solve like enormous and life-changing problems, because you can solve like computationally challenges that are not solvable by any classical computers of today. And these problems, of course, are very interesting. They come in many different forms in physics, chemistry, and biology, like, for example, in molecular simulation, drug design, materials design for batteries, optimization problems, just to name a few.
Thank you so much. Like, just before I head over, is the audience hearing the stream okay? Like our online guests? Yeah? Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, and we will go into and look into the potentials and trends. And I mean, obviously, quantum computing is D1 that we're talking about. So we will learn a bit more about that in a second. But before that, we go from trained physicist to trained physicist. Emily, can you just introduce yourself?
Of course. Thanks for having me today. Really glad to be with you all, half virtually, half in real life. So as you said, I'm also a physicist by training. I used to work with 2D materials, so did a bit of time in the labs and in the white rooms paving away, but pretty quickly realized that I was much more concerned with taking technology out of the labs and into the real world, rather than doing the much more difficult work, which is staying in the labs and actually developing the tech. And that led me to deep tech and my role at Speedinvest about a year and a half ago. So Speedinvest, we're a pan-European fund with offices all over Europe, in France, Germany, and the UK and Austria. Also early stage investors, and within the deep tech team, we look at all the usual suspects of deep tech, from AI to ML to quantum, material science, semiconductors, and more. And I'd say that my personal focus of investment has really been around quantum as well. So hopefully I can contribute to this conversation too. Recently just finished another master's in quantum technologies to make sure I can know what I'm talking about and keep staying true to the scientists that we're helping. And yeah, I'll leave it from there. So thanks for having me.
Perfect. Thanks so much. We will dig about that a little bit deeper. But last but not least, Sam, tell us about your work at OpenOcean and your focus.
Yeah, sure. Hi, and thanks for having me on. So my background's not as academic as the other ones, so I'm going to sound very silly now. So I have a vanilla computer science degree, and actually got that because I originally wanted to build video games as a youngster. Quickly decided that wasn't for me, and I ended up actually building enterprise software at JP Morgan around cash management just after the financial crisis. Did that for some years, and then stopped writing code and started growing companies, and became an operations manager at Uber when it was kind of going gangbusters around 2015 and growing like crazy. Did that for some time, and then went super early and joined a full fiber broadband company as a director of customer experience. And then I started doing sales and marketing. So I've kind of done it all, I guess, without doing like actually following the finances. So and now I find myself, the past few years, I've been at OpenOcean, which has been phenomenal. And for those who don't know, OpenOcean's background is really founding MySQL and then later MariaDB, which are obviously two major, very technical companies that come out of Europe. And of course, MySQL in particular was very seminal at the time. Because of this, as you might imagine, we focus a lot on open source technology, which I think is a growing trend, particularly in Europe, I might add. We look a lot at data infrastructure, quantum. We're very proud to say IQM is also in the portfolio of OpenOcean, and we love working with those guys. And we also look at intelligent automation. We've all seen the UiPath story that's come through, and we believe there's lots more to come around automating much of the work that we do day to day. And much of that gets very technical, obviously, because AI starts to come into play, etc. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and OpenOcean.
Thanks so much for joining us all tonight, this afternoon, actually. First, I want to start, and Kuan, maybe you can answer that best. Just elaborate a little bit, why is it so important to create and scale up deep tech in Europe? And, that said, maybe also what challenges did you face when starting IQM? Maybe we just go about that as the beginning.
Yeah, that's a very great question. I think that one of the main reasons that we need to have this, creation or scale up of this deep tech in Europe is that one of them is that we can get faster time to market for, obviously different type of the disruptive technologies, and it's not only for creation of these technologies for the betterment of humankind, but these technologies will be the engines of tomorrow's economy as well. So it really drives the economy forward in the long term. And also one of the other reasons is that we have a lot of great talents here in Europe, especially in all these deep tech sectors. And having companies and ecosystem here would help to foster the development of all these technologies with our own talents. And we also ensure that there's no brain drain of all these creative talents to other continents or other places in the world. Yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, but last point is that all these critical technologies eventually having a lot of all this, nowadays we see, especially in quantum, there's this sovereignty argument coming into play, and therefore you cannot rely on like other blocks to help with this critical technology. So we need to have all this in place.
Thanks. And actually looking at that, I think looking at the state of play, where are we with that, Anne-Sophie? I think, Kuan just tapped into, let's say, where he started, his challenges, and I think also why too. But let's maybe tap into like, where are we with that? And do you think that, there's still a gap, especially looking into deep tech investments towards, let's say, more software enhanced startups? That's number one. And then maybe also number two, do you think that the pandemic, maybe accelerated looking a bit further into, deep tech and biotech and so on?
Yes, obviously. Well, there are differences between soft companies and other deep tech companies. When you have deep tech with, be it biology or hardware, because obviously at Elaia we invest in various multi-tech companies. You first have the step of the IP transfer, which is always a challenging one because we have to negotiate with the great academic institutions, and we developed a practice and a team at Elaia to perform on that and to try to go as fast as possible, because we have to enter from, as Emily said, the academic world and timing to the startup timeline, which is not the same. And in deep tech and hardware, we see less funds eager to invest at the earlier stage. So we have less competitors, but we also know that at Elaia we always do the first round on our own, but then we need friends to co-invest with us. And when we go to deep tech with hardware startups, we know that we will also have less co-investors for the later stage. So you need to be even more selective in the quality of the deal flow that you are analyzing to make sure that you are on a future scale-up one, so that you will have the company which will be able to make the differentiation when it goes to Series A. And this is the second point of your question about what has the pandemic changed. What we saw at Elaia was a great differentiation in our early stage companies, and in the market. We saw some portfolio in some friends where maybe they had difficulty in the portfolio. So we saw some friends for a few months work less on new deals. So sometimes we inherited even greater places in rounds in 2020 because some co-investors had to save their money to heal some of their participation in the portfolio. And other funds were able to continue to invest because they had no difficulty in our portfolio. And this was what happened at Elaia. And then for a startup who was raising funds at that time, and it still continues to be a little the same right now, there is a great difference between the startups who were so-so and who faced the fact that less investors were investing. So it became even more difficult to raise funds at that period. And at the opposite, the startups which were doing great made even more difference because the remaining funds who were still working, they needed deal flow. And so we saw even more competition on the good deal flow. So what pandemic makes was an acceleration of market momentum for some fields like digital for health, like infra cloud, like cybersecurity, which were by luck firms that we had decided to target at Elaia. And so in these fields, the go-to-market went even faster. And at the same time, the good companies, surprisingly, had no difficulty to raise fund, great valuation. And the companies which were in less good conditions found it even more difficult.
Looking at that actually, and I mean, you just tapped into that, right? So I think, and we talk about that a bit later again, but I think, obviously deep tech comes also a lot from scientific research, and of course at the EIC and the EIC Fund, we in particular look also at these, projects that also turn into companies at this early stage. Like just looking at the deal sourcing also from your end, like where do you start and how early are you having conversations with them? Is that already at the scientific status quo at the university? Like how do you go about that and how early do you talk to them really to kind of discover the potential, I guess, of this upscale? Anne-Sophie, maybe you can just answer on that and then we go over to Sam.
Sure, with pleasure. It's never too early to talk. A few of our companies, we happen to know the scientific researcher when he was still at the laboratory with no idea about creating a company. Akimia, for instance, which is an AI company for drug discovery, it's a researcher from physics department who had put in algorithm the Schrödinger equation, calculating molecular orbitals. And this researcher had been working 15 years to put the Schrödinger equation in algorithm. And we happened to meet him in the laboratories of École Normale Supérieure in Paris, just because we are several at Elaia coming from this school. And we know the head of the laboratories, they are in our personal friend network. So we met Maximilien, who had done this great algorithm, being able to calculate with approximations the Schrödinger equation. And we were thinking, what could be the use of such a thing? And then at the Boston Consulting Group, we met this fantastic lady who was working with clients who were a big pharma company looking for tools for drug discovery. And then we thought, but this algorithm maybe could help. And we helped them meet together. And that was love at first sight. So they decided that obviously there was a use case for this algorithm, which was drug discovery. And that they got on very well together and that they had skills that were completely complementary. So they decided to create the company and we helped them transfer the IP from Maximilien and École Normale Supérieure into the company, and we invested the day they created the company. But we had been talking with Maximilien for 2 years before, when he had no sparring partner. So we knew that he had something very valuable, but because we did not have the business use case, the company was not created yet. And we now have in our portfolio, our deep tech portfolio, I think we have 6 companies where we have the same kind of nice story, where we knew the scientific founders and we in a way had them form the team with the business partner. And we invested when the use case was found. The first customer had shown traction and for commercialization, and at each time the product was ready.
Thanks. Thanks for those use cases. And I think looking at that, and I think, you're just describing also the cases that are very common, I guess. We have an extremely, long go-to-market, but then again, we're talking about highly disruptive companies and solutions usually. If we're just looking at, obviously, vaccination again and the mRNA technology. But Sam, maybe, as we know, it's kind of extremely hard to predict what's going to be the disruptive technology in 5 years, where we already have to work on it right now. But what are the trends that you are watching right now in the deep tech sector, and that will be the game changer for, let's say, the next 5 years?
Yeah, and that's the billion-dollar question, right? If I knew the answer to that, it'd be very easy. I think what makes me more comfortable as an investor is to lean into things that I know to be true. So you can't predict what will be the biggest company, etc., but you can definitely find some things that are true, right? So things like we know that the data sphere, as get called, is growing, right? We know we're producing more data than ever. We can see that use cases that require real-time data are increasing, hand over fist. So there are certainly things going on that can help at least narrow your horizons to where you think there will be interesting opportunities. OpenOcean has basically a data thesis, right? So most of what we look at has to have some kind of data story within it. I think actually, leaning into the European theme here, the European ecosystem definitely has some kind of unique strengths when we talk about data sovereignty and privacy, and a lot of the regulations, right, that are coming out into the world are kind of starting here, GDPR being a very good example. And I think because of that, looking at Europe, I think where we can find some really cool deep tech companies where perhaps you wouldn't find them so readily in other parts of the world, because of course places like the USA are still the hub of most venture activity. I think when we look at things like data federation and data virtualization, a lot of things around cryptography, we're talking about drug discovery. There's huge use cases that need to be tackled where data needs to be sort of managed in a very sort of private way where we can get the benefit, but in a collaborative fashion, right? So, we've seen plenty of opportunities in that space, and you probably saw that Oaken raised a very large round recently, and I think, credit to them in this sort of medical sphere around leveraging data. Although I would add, isn't it a shame that, kind of some of the coverage there refers to Oaken as an American company, because that's where they ended up. And I think that's one of the challenges that Europe has, is that we produce lots of really great talents, and we've got some of the best universities, and we start some of the best companies. I think the big challenge actually for the next 5 years to make sure we back really good winners is to try and keep them here, actually, because then we'll get more winners. Because actually when those companies eventually have their exits, and I look at it like, sort of seeds from a plant, right? You want the plant to grow, but when the seeds come off it, you would like those seeds to land in Europe and not in North America. But, I think that's a long-term thing. So, yeah, I think, a few of those things I'm extremely bullish on, but there's no lack, right? I mean, we've all seen what's happened with AI and machine learning, but again, I would say, I think sometimes we get ahead of ourselves. There's lots of great stuff happening in AI and machine learning in Europe. But we all know that if you're bullish on AI and machine learning, you firstly have to be bullish on data, because most companies still haven't solved the data problem, let alone the leveraging of AI. And there's great companies still in Europe, like Calibra, that are at the forefront of this. And I expect things like data catalogs and the like to continue to be big focuses of enterprises, therefore great opportunities for early stage companies. But I mean, I could talk for hours, right? There's lots of great things to look out for.
Good. I mean, you just tapped into actually, obviously tech sovereignty. I mean, that's going to be a whole other discussion. And actually, I think after this panel, there's going to be another panel entirely around that. So definitely tune in for that. Also, before I go further, I totally forgot at the beginning of the session that if you have questions from the audience, please go to Slido with the hashtag EIC, and then you can just type in your questions, and I will recall them at the end of the session and take them from the screen here. So just mentioning that to the audience here and also online. But before that, also, Sam, you just tapped into, again, I guess, also the sourcing part and, where ideas are coming from, and especially sort of the combination of scientific research, universities, and then building companies. Emily, maybe just one more time, let's look into that just briefly. What are the barriers that you do see, and how can we overcome them from this, let's say, kind of gap coming from the research part from universities and actually setting up companies? How can we solve that, and what are the challenges they do see the most?
Yeah, of course. Well, I guess there are some challenges that are broad to the deep tech ecosystem and some that are more specific to Europe. My sort of grand theory of how to help deep tech is just to really provide support to scientists and researchers like as early as possible. I think it's very easy to forget how much of a bubble we're in like the startup and VC world. Compared to what's actually going on in like the research labs and corridors between different laboratories. I mean, business is still like largely a bad word in a lot of academic environments. And so I think just planting the seed of showing that commercialization and like building a startup around your technology is a viable option to get this tech to grow and develop it, not only from like an intellectual curiosity point of view, but also just to make it as useful as possible to people around, will do an enormous amount of help to the ecosystem. And, that needs to be done at the university level, at the committee level of different nation initiatives, and also on the European level. And it seems very basic, but that's my theory. I'm convinced that would go a long way. And then maybe some barriers that I see that are perhaps specific to Europe compared to, for example, Asia or the US. The US in particular, I mean, in Europe, we have sometimes a misalignment of incentives between national incentives and European-wide incentives. And it's a very fine balance between creating healthy competition, but also positive collaboration and consolidation. And I think finding that balance can be very difficult because exactly, you need that competitiveness. And I think sometimes we tend towards wanting to overly de-risk things compared to, for example, the US that might be a little bit more proactive and quick in their decision making. So it comes from a good place, and I think, and when we talk about, for example, data sovereignty and protection and encryption, all of these things, it has a very good effect because we're ahead of the game in a lot of those areas. But on the other side, sometimes I think it can slow us down because we wait to test many times before taking a risk. And I think that sometimes maybe slows Europe down a little bit, but we are making progress. So I think the takeaways would be really like educate more about commercialization and the possibility of taking technology out of the lab and trying to maybe be a little bit more brave on a European scale about when we're proactive about certain areas of investment.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, talking about de-risking, right? I guess by all means, we know that this is much more capital intense and of course very high bets investing in deep tech. But, you know, looking at also solutions, I mean, we just talked about that there is still, you know, quite a funding gap, especially in deep tech across Europe. But also looking at, you know, the initiatives, and maybe Kuan, you can just talk about that. Like, you know, what's the idea setup and how did it develop for you looking into the combination of, you know, governmental research and the private market support? And yeah, can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, so when starting up IKEA, we definitely see a lot of support, especially from the government side initially when we receive, like for example, in this grant fundings that we get for starting up the company, and of course, like in the seed funding round, we receive a lot of confidence and trust from the investors in trying to scale up the company, because in reality we are the most risky, if you like, hardware company because our capital expenditure is like really much higher than any software companies. But we really have this sort of vision that we will overcome like most of the problems that we see, and moving towards also the sales cases that we have initially was really much a B2G sales to the Finnish government that really believed that this quantum computing technology would fly. So that obviously is a really strong support from the local government. And also from the, we are really lucky and fortunate to receive this EIC accelerator funding that really helped kickstart the R&D and infrastructure building within the company. So so we see that all this has to come together. And in terms of like, you know, trying to set up sales to, you know, initiate ecosystems in quantum, you really need the alignment of different sectors, like the private sector, the governments, the public sector. All has to be aligned together to be able to deliver such a project or you know, a product like from the company as well. So yeah, so it is really a balance between all of these different aspects, and yeah, this is one of the challenges that we initially faced, and we are still facing today when we try to expand our market to other countries in Europe and potentially overseas as well.
Thanks. Yeah, actually looking, you know, maybe one step further, and I'm actually taking one question from Slido right now. Because I think it's a nice kind of handover there. So one question here that we have, and you're all free to take it. You know, looking at Europe, which is obviously a highly fragmented series of markets, and so scale-ups with customers in the domestic market need a lot of help finding customers in different regions. Then the question is like, I mean, hey, how about to go about that? And then B, also how you perform, let's say, networking for that purpose. Who wants to take that one?
I can go first because I feel like that's highly relevant to sort of Speedinvest approach. So I guess it maybe doesn't apply to all funds, but we really see ourselves as pan-European, and we've built up the networks ourselves in each of these regions. So we go on a much more like we're on the ground running with the teams, and that means that we can leverage, our network of LPs, but also of investors that are really, on the ground in these different countries. But if you're not located physically in them, I think also just with the digital world, right, you can build up these proprietary networks pretty well if you get a little bit creative and play with LinkedIn a little bit. So I think just in terms of building up that network, it's accessible, and most deep tech investors that I know have this European-wide vision. So I would actually say that perhaps despite the fragmented aspects of Europe, there is enough consolidation on that aspect, and then the challenge is to go overseas, right? So if you want to go to the US or into Asia or different regions of the world, then you need to think about a totally different way of doing business and expansion into markets. But I'll throw over to the rest of the panel if you want to add anything.
Sorry, go ahead. And did you want to go?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Emily just said. When we look at our young companies, well, we always ask the questions, when do you go international, and what's your personal target on that? So obviously we only select companies who have the ambition to go international. And well, they begin, we mainly invest in France, but we have companies in all countries around us in the portfolio, if I remember. And we, on our side, we accompany them with the fundraise because very often when they go for Series A, yes, I think at Series A, they always fund in UK or in the USA because they are at that moment going to market to the USA. And as Emily said, when they go to the American market, very often they are organized to have a member of the team in the USA. We did not see any company thriving the commercialization in America without a team in America. And very often it happens that they have to move the headquarters. And an organization that we see which works absolutely great is to have a lot of the tech skills and team and the research and the product team in Europe, and to have the commercialization teams abroad and in the USA when they go to market in the USA, and in other country in Asia when they go to market in Asia. It's the scheme that we see the most often, and it begins at around the Series A, and then we tend to accompany this commercial growth of the company with the localization of the fundraise.
Well, then it's our job to change that, I guess. Keep them in Europe for sure. But looking at the investor's perspective, and we just talked about the go-to-market, like just from your perspective, and that's another question from Slido that I'm taking, can you share the ideal and acceptable go-to-market entry time for deep tech solutions?
Well, happy to chime in here.
Please.
I don't know if there's a black and white answer to that, frankly. It's, I definitely think obviously you shouldn't think about it before you can prove it in kind of your local market. It sounds silly to throw a lot of money, and it is a lot of money when we talk about these US-based sales offices right there. And you look at like where the money goes from a Series A, and quite right, that's generally when it starts to be a topic. The vast majority of it goes into sales and marketing generally, right? And the vast majority of that is going to be on salaries, obviously, and maybe some real estate. So I think it doesn't make sense just kind of empirically to look at it before you can prove it in your home market, unless there's some kind of strange nuance that there really is no market in your home market and you have to go abroad. But then I would question the origins of the company being where it's founded, right? So it's a tricky one. But I would say, I mean, there's no number you can put on it for revenue and things. I think one of the very hard things around deep tech, right, is that it doesn't have the same growth profile in a revenue perspective that most investors have been completely made comfortable with over the past few decades, right? And that's one of the reasons there's a big deficit in deep tech investors, because they don't have the mentality or familiarity and comfort with what the growth profile looks like on a deep tech company. So it's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I think generally you will be looking at that Series A stage, and you must have some, even if it's not necessarily revenue generating, but some kind of sort of concrete use cases, pilots, something that makes sense, right? And as I say, I don't think there's a silver bullet there, but it's somewhat intuitive, right? That you shouldn't be going elsewhere until you can prove it where you are at this moment in time.
Talking about that, actually, just diving into another one also from Slido, talking about capital intensity. We have one here. What kind of advice would you give to fresh startups with little funding in the semiconductor deep tech space? Who wants to go with this one? Where to start, I guess. Maybe Kuan. Maybe that's one for you.
So I guess advice to the investors is that, it's going back to exactly what Sam was mentioning earlier. You kind of have to be patient because typically, in this deep tech startup, we are looking at this growth stage where it's similar to this hockey stick, but you don't know where the inflection point will be. So it's like a really big risk that you have to be comfortable with, and at the same time, taking IKM for an example, we just basically launched our foundry just last week, and that is really very similar to building a foundry like in typical semiconductor industry, but much smaller scale, and that requires a lot of capex investment, and that requires a lot of balancing between our equity funding with trying to learn, as founders of companies, we started from not knowing what a cap table is to learning how to utilize different financial instruments to fund this sort of project. And at the same time, we have to really utilize a lot of all these potential, known markets that we can tap into, plus the markets that we really like to tap into, such as the one that is in quantum, which is not really a market at the moment, but we have to define it. And so all in all, I would just say you kind of have to be patient, and also you be prepared to really follow all the way through to exit. I think that's easier said than done. Because,
maybe I could add something because, I'm passionate by these fields, and I think that typically it's very useful to have the multiple tools that are settled. We have for the first step in France, we have BPI France, and then you have all the great job done here at UIC. And for this kind of fields, who can definitely be great reward, and I experienced this, I had the luck to experience this in my younger years with former investments in the semiconductor industry. Sometimes you just need a little longer time, but then you will get the great money. And I think that having the help at this time from huge institutions like UIC, who are able to have this a little longer term vision, is definitely a great help, because this vision can really earn big money in the end. So it's a good bet. It just sometimes needs a little longer time than what pure private investors are able to mobilize.
That's actually nicely tapping into another question I got here. Looking at the usual return on investment that the private sector would want to see. Let's say they would expect that in maybe 4, 5, 6 years time, and I mean obviously that's a very big contradiction also with the patience and the long period that we just talked about. Like how do you look at that, and how can we potentially overcome that? That's probably also one for Emily, Sam, or Anne-Sophie.
Yeah, I think I should know the numbers, but I don't know them off by heart. But I think if you look actually at the percentage of startups and try to see how long it takes them to get this famous unicorn status, there's actually the same amount of deep tech startups that reach unicorn status within 5 years compared to network effects, and actually product and scale-led startups have around 25 or 30% that reach unicorn status within 1 to 5 years. So I think there's sometimes a little bit of a misconception about the timelines in deep tech. It can take longer, but can also very well play the same game as other types of growth in like tech startups. But in general, yeah, it will depend of the case and how complex the value chain, etc. But I think there are often actually misconceptions around the timelines here. But I'll throw it back to the rest of the panel to add on that.
No, totally. I mean, also with that said, and again, we talked about, the long investment horizon, but what would be, let's say, relevant traction? And that's another question from Slido here. That would, what could be a relevant traction, and I guess also a relevant traction argument for VC to come in? Like, when would you consider that relevant in the deep tech space? Like, what would be kind of your go-to on that?
So I guess one of the big measures that we look at in deep tech is different proof of concept projects, partnerships, and pilots. These are a really good way to demonstrate industrial validation of what you're trying to deploy. And while it may not be a huge revenue generating thing at the beginning, it means that first of all, you're building these relationships. So rather than, constructing a revenue machine in the beginning, really what you're building is a relationship machine, especially in deep tech, because you need these relationships to be stable and be there all the way down the journey, because like we said, the timelines can be longer. So that's usually a pretty good starting point for us to see that we're reaching a state of commercialization. And then the key is, of course, to turn these pilots and proof of concepts into actual customers that can grow in the long term. And that's the trickier part, of course. I think there's one recipe that fills all of the techniques there, but I would say we look at that a lot.
I can just
just to add one word to Emily, and because sometimes it seems to be a little forgotten, the market size. Although it can be a great technology, definitely before we find the market fit, we have to have this conviction that the market size is huge for this super breakthrough innovation.
Yeah, I totally, I think both of those points are bang on. And also on the market side, it's also maybe because I think Kuan said, right, the market for quantum today is not massive. We have to have a very high level of conviction that the market will be very, very, very big in the future, right? So, and I think this is why many investors, when we talk about the funding gap on deep tech, it's because it's a completely different playbook, right? You can't lift and shift your playbook from doing kind of typical SaaS to then doing deep tech, because you're going to ask for the spreadsheets of traction and you're not going to get them, and you're not going to see the unit economics. It becomes a much more qualitative evaluation. And this is why also, to be honest, there's a skills gap actually in the venture community, because we're probably a generation or so perhaps away from having a great number of deep tech funds where the investors themselves actually have the credentials and know how to assess, because otherwise you're going to feel like at sea, right? And very nervous about making any investments because it's so unusual, right? Let's say it's a totally different playbook. So for me, on traction for a deep tech company, it can be basically nil. I think it really comes down to being thesis driven, and I know that's a bit of an overused term in VC, but it does exist, I promise you. And actually having a view on the world and these big markets that perhaps are big markets today, and then finding the right team that has the right idea and the right know-how to seize them in 5-10 years time.
Coming from those, let's say, go-to measurements to the showstoppers, and that's a question I got here. What are considered showstoppers on a cap table perspective from a, let's say, a rather early stage deep tech side of things?
I think I can chime in a little bit here. Probably one of the most recurring issues that can come up in deep tech startups is when the startup is spinning out of perhaps a research institution or a university. Universities have very different approaches to how much they will take in the company for the intellectual property or licensing fees or just using facilities. I think it's quite a big debate actually in the community what an appropriate number is, but definitely making sure that as much of the company as possible is in the hands of the founders is super, super important. And it applies as well for investors, right? Because we want to get our stake on the cap table too, but we're also very conscious that if we bite too much into it at the beginning, we're only shooting ourselves in the foot. So just being open and transparent about that conversation. But yeah, that's not really a specific point, but I think definitely how much the research institutions and universities take in the early stages can be a red flag sometimes.
Thanks for that. Okay, wait, we have another one here. I'm like just looking at it. We have another one on Slido. One more question. So we have a hardware software company building a virtual fitting room solution with lifelike avatars, and the goal is to reduce merchandise returns. And they already had pilots in different regions. But then the question is how you perform. Oh, sorry, now it's gonna go gone. Let me quickly see. Where did it go? There we go. What would be the best approach for fundraising for the nascent industry and new technology? So hardware software company building a virtual fitting room solution for lifelike avatars. How would you go about that one?
Well, I'm happy to give a few words on that. So, if I could just give a bit of general advice, I mean, that's a specific case, right? But I do think, particularly when we talk about deep tech or you're talking about fitting rooms and things there's obviously an industrial or vertical, should we say, slant to it. I do think you should really be careful about who you reach out to, because you could waste a lot of energy, frankly, trying to speak to a lot of investors who may even take calls of you, but actually, perhaps realistically would never progress it. So I guess my general advice would be to really try and find people who know that market, because if it's something that's deep tech, and then by definition, right, it's probably quite a way away from being commercially viable and all kind of usual hallmarks. But then when you couple it with something which that sounds to be like, call it the fashion industry or high street retail, again, you're in a certain segment where a lot of certainly there's a certain segment of investors that like that market, and quite a lot that probably will be somewhat fearful of it because they don't know it. So I think when you start thinking about going to the market and you have this kind of product with this kind of targeted market, is to do quite a lot of homework and really list out and give grades to the investors that you really want to speak to, and not just the funds but the individuals, right? Because you can go reach out to the right fund and speak to the wrong person, and it's never going to see the light of day internally, even though it could have done if you'd gone to the right person inside the fund. So it's a bit of a Russian doll, but that's just a bit of general advice. I think I see a lot of the kind of scattergun approach to finding the investors, and I think that's actually oftentimes the wrong approach, and a much more kind of concerted and thoughtful approach will probably yield greater results. Although it might feel like it's a numbers game, actually it's not just a numbers game in terms of the outreach.
Thanks for that one. I'm conscious about time. Maybe there's one last one from Slido, and then if there's any questions in the audience, please, then this is also your chance to maybe ask to speak up if you don't want to put them on Slido. But going back to market attractiveness, I got one which is probably a really big one, but maybe Anne-Sophie, you can start with that one, and whoever wants to chime in. Like, what holds the bigger way, you would say, talking about market attractiveness, size or growth?
Sorry, I didn't catch your last word.
Like, what would be the bigger way when talking about market attractiveness? The, let's say, original size or the growth potential?
Both, of course. Look, as I think it was Sam saying, sometimes it's market creation. So you have an idea of what the market size will be, but maybe it's not yet materialized because the go-to-market hasn't been done yet. But it's an estimation, and it should be around 1 billion euro. If you are not able to see that size, I would say it will be difficult to have a growing path for the company, which will make a big company. And then definitely we have to see how the team is executing their go-to-market and what growing path they will be able to achieve. But this is more an assessment on the team ability to achieve well. And very often when we invest, because we invest early, we don't know yet exactly what will be their growing path. But we made the bet on this team because we analyze that they are a team which will be able to achieve that, to surperform the business plan that they propose.
Thanks so much. So I'm looking at the time right now. So we got 1 minute left, which would be probably one question if there is any from the audience. I think I have all of them from Slido. I'm just looking if there is any other. Yes, there is. Can we get a microphone into the... thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Milda Kakolskaite. I'm from European Cybersecurity Organization. My question would be about the title of this panel, as you talk about deep tech made in Europe, and of course about the entire title of the event. What do you mean by Europe? Because Europe is not equal to the EU, and I'm concretely talking about the UK, because I guess UK left the EU, but not Europe. And I'm asking these questions because here at EXO we launched recently a new initiative, Cybersecurity Made in Europe, which is a marketing label for European cybersecurity companies. And for us, UK is still Europe, so we include UK in our scheme, and UK companies can get the label if they meet the criteria. But what about, I know, your perspective as EAC and also the speakers, investors who talked on this topic? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I will give that one to our investors maybe. I mean, you know, while I know that you are not limited, I guess, also to invest in Europe, but is there any perspective from your end? I think looking at Europe, looking at EU, but just generally your investment horizon, I guess.
Yeah, definitely we invest companies in the UK. We just made one in Quantum, so there is no problem. We can.
And maybe as the British person on the panel, I feel obliged to say that we're very much just over the channel still, and we haven't gone anywhere. Yeah, look, Europe for us is the EU plus Switzerland and the UK, and you know, it's look, it's a fuzzy definition, right? I mean, I know investors that include Turkey and Israel in Europe. I know investors that don't. I know investors that include Russia and Belarus in it. I know investors that don't. So it doesn't, you know, there's no scientific kind of definition of it, or maybe there is actually. No one listens to it. I think what's more important is that there is like a common sort of ground, right? I mean, like, it's hard to explain, but you know when you're in Europe, right? And I think for us, there's also a time thing here, right? Like we can invest in America, nothing says we can't, but there's some realities that it's hard for us to collaborate with countries when there's an 8-hour, 6-hour time difference. So give or take an hour or two, that's pretty much, let's say, in Europe. It works for us as investors, and it works for the founders who need us at the end of the telephone when we're ideally awake.
Thanks. And maybe just to answer, like, and then this wrap this up from an ESG perspective. I mean, you know, obviously we consider the entire ecosystem also as partners and co-investors. And I mean, of course, there is, let's say, especially in the equity part, limitations due to Brexit, which we, you know, didn't choose obviously. But I mean, of course, still there is collaboration, and also on the grant side, that it's still eligible. And I hope I don't say anything wrong, but that's like the status quo. And I'm happy to answer some more questions off stage, I guess. So that said, to our speakers online, thanks so much for joining. Yeah, if there are any other further questions, I will be around, and have a great afternoon at the rest of the event. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.